My name is Safiullah. I work at the City Library as a program manager. On behalf of the City Library, I welcome you all to tonight's lecture. Professor Tom Maloney from University of Utah, who works as professor at the Economics Department and also director of Tanner Human Rights Center, is going to introduce the lecture and also the speaker. Tom Maloney.
Thanks very much. I'm Tom Maloney. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Utah and the director of the Barbara L. and Norman C. Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy. And it's my privilege to welcome you all to our 6th annual International Conference on Human Rights, Conflict Resolution, Nonviolence, and Peace. This year's conference is on global justice, economic globalization, crisis, and the common good. And this is certainly a very ambitious theme. Over the next 2 days, we will examine the consequences of the increasingly interconnected nature of our world. We will examine a great variety of such consequences. How does economic globalization affect living standards within countries and prospects for development in less developed places? How does it affect political institutions within nations and political relations between countries? How does it affect, in particular, women, minorities, and indigenous populations? How does it affect our ability to respond to global challenges, such as climate change and population growth? Can we harness the power of globalization and limit its negative consequences in a way that ensures, or at least moves toward, justice and equity? That's a big agenda, so be sure to get plenty of rest over the next couple of days. And I hope you'll be able to join us for some of our panels. Those will begin at the Officers Club at Fort Douglas at the University of Utah tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Panels will continue Thursday and Friday. And we'll have a second keynote lecture by Richard Miller of Cornell University in the Moot Courtroom at the S.J. Quinney College of Law tomorrow at 12:15. And I also want to mention we'll have a final roundtable discussion led by Joel Rosenthal of the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs on Friday at 2 o'clock at the Officers Club up in Fort Douglas. Our ability to engage in this work is a direct result of the generosity of the Tanner family, Barbara and Norman Tanner and Deb Sawyer. I want to thank them again for their vision in establishing the center and for their extraordinarily generous ongoing support. Please join me in acknowledging them. Thank you. Each Tanner Center conference is organized by a distinct team of University of Utah faculty who develop the theme throughout the course of a year, invite the speakers, and organize the program. And I want to thank this year's team for their outstanding effort, especially Dean Chatterjee of the University of Utah Department of Philosophy, who chaired the committee, as well as Tony Angie, Wayne McCormick, and Erica George of the S.J. Quinney College of Law, Korkut Erturk of the Department of Economics, Steve Ott of the Department of Political Science and the Institute for Public and International Affairs, and Polly Wiesner of the Department of Anthropology. And beyond the core faculty team, a number of departments and centers at the university, as well as local organizations, help make this conference possible through a variety of kinds of support. This year's conference has benefited from the generosity of our partners in the College of Humanities, the College of Social and Behavioral Science, the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs, the Office of the Vice President for Institutional Advancement, and the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And I particularly want to thank the College of Law and their Dean Hiram Chodosh for their collaboration with us on tomorrow's second keynote lecture by Richard Miller, and for their help in promoting these events. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the David Eccles School of Business, the Democracy in South Asia Forum, the Department of Economics, Department of Philosophy and Sociology, the Health, Society and Policy Program, the Institute of Public and International Affairs, the International Center, the International Studies Program, the Peace and Conflict Studies Program, the Scott M. Matheson Center for Healthcare Studies, and the Tanner Humanities Center, all at the University of Utah. The Center for the Study of Ethics at Utah Valley University, the Tanner McMurran Lecture Series Endowment at Westminster College, and of course the Salt Lake Main Library. And finally, I want to thank the staff of the center, Alita Tu, Victoria Medina, and our intern, Marianne Carpenter. So that's a long list, but it takes a lot of people and a lot of effort to put on these programs. So I want to make sure we acknowledge all those folks. Thank you. Please note that there will be a public reception right outside those doors after tonight's lecture. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Chatterjee of the Department of Philosophy, who will introduce tonight's opening keynote speaker. Dean.
Richard FALK is the icon of our time. Such a giant, I feel not only, of course, honored, but humbled as well with this task of trying to introduce him. I don't know how to proceed, but I'll try my best. Professor Richard FALK is Albert G. Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University, where he was a member of the faculty for 40 years, from 1961 to 2001. Since 2002, he has been a distinguished visiting professor of global and international studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where he directs a project on climate change, human security, and democracy. In 2010, he served as a member of the Turkish delegation to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Cancun, Mexico. Professor FALK has been the special rapporteur on occupied Palestine for the United Nations Human Rights Council since 2008. He is also chair of the board Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. In 2008-2009, he served as a senior advisor to the President of the United Nations General Assembly. He serves on the editorial boards of The Nation and the Progressive magazines. He is also an honorary editor of the American Journal of International Law and a member of the International Advisory Editorial Boards of Third World Quarterly and Globalizations. Over the years, Professor FALK has published over 50 books, including some titles here: Legal Order in a Violent World, This Endangered Planet, Prospects and Proposals for Human Survival, A Study of Future Worlds, Predatory Globalizations, A Critique, Religion and Humane Global Governance. His most recent book is Achieving Human Rights, that came out in 2009, and an edited volume entitled Legality and Legitimacy in World Affairs, that came out this last year. At present, Professor FALK's main research interests relate to climate change as a world order problem, Israel-Palestine conflict, legitimacy wars, quote unquote, nuclear weaponry, and the pursuit of a nonviolent geopolitics. Quite a tall order, and he has been the leader in all these directions for all these years. I must mention a few other just quick things. Professor FALK is, of course, a public intellectual whose contributions to both scholarly and policy debates has been considerable. He was an early adopter of what has evolved into the international law, international relations methodological subfield, starting with the World Order Models project. His analytical and normative concepts have identified both the obstacles to humane governance and human security and the opportunities for developing their chief antidote, strengthening, mobilizing, and democratizing global civil society. The effort has been a slow, often painful evolution, but still progress. Despite his caution at embracing the emergence of a new global structures, particularly in the wake of 9/11's displacement of a post-Westphalian order, he retains optimism and continues to make concrete solutions. In public service, he has never been unduly controversial, stating his beliefs and conclusions calmly but clearly. He has mentored generations of scholars and participated in joint projects that have both established new academic approaches and moved public debates closer to ways that North and South, East and West together in university and public settings can forge cooperation in a more just world. So, with this brief introduction, nothing of course matches who he is, that's a futile effort. It's our great honor and pleasure and delight that we got Professor Richard FALK with us here to deliver this important lecture. Professor FALK.
Professor Maloney, Professor Chatterjee, ladies and gentlemen, it's an intimidating honor to have this role of speaking at the start of this most impressive conference. And I want to thank the conveners who arranged for all of us to be here, and to thank the Tanner Center for its sponsorship of this event. I'm always a bit concerned by overly generous introductions because they create very high expectations that I'm almost dedicated to disappoint. And that's particularly true given the breadth of this conference theme. I've decided to try to approach global justice indirectly, taking as my foundation for these remarks tonight an essay by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who spoke about living well together on the earth, asking what it means to talk of not just living together, but living well together. We, of course, as a matter of fact, live together. But the issue of living well together raises a normative set of goals, aspirations, potentialities. And what I am trying to suggest tonight in a very exploratory manner is the thesis that we are at a historical moment where living together necessitates the transition to living well together. And that this is something that is unprecedented in human history, that it's always been sustainable to live together without questioning in any profound way the tenability of that way of living together. Now, of course, that generalization requires some qualification, but I think what I'm trying to suggest is a certain originality posed by the kind of impacts that Professor Maloney referred to when he was discussing the effects of globalization. My hypothesis is that the most profound way of interpreting the impact of globalization is to bring together in this unexplored terrain of the tension between cohabiting on the planet and somehow finding a normative community that encompasses that cohabitation. That's something that is a challenge to me, and a challenge I haven't attempted to meet in the past, and probably will be sorry by the end of this talk that I tried to meet it tonight, but nevertheless it's too late to turn back. I'm trying really to presuppose that the combination of circumstances associated with climate change, what might be called the squeeze on energy capabilities, and problems of water scarcity bring together a situation of crisis that either will produce catastrophic harm or will generate a transformative politics and a form of global governance that does embody at least the elementary ingredients of global justice. This is inherently an interpretive approach to the larger agenda of world order. And I was somewhat influenced, I guess the right word is, by a saying of Henry David Thoreau, and his words were, "It is not what you look at that matters, but what you see." And part of what I'm trying to suggest is that we have to learn to see in a 21st century mode if we are to address this very fundamental set of challenges. Let me first try to suggest the originality of this crisis circumstance. And I think that the best way of expressing it is that this is a crisis of global proportions that can only be solved globally. And this contrasts with past collective crises that could be solved or not civilizationally or at the level of some organized community that was part of the world, but not the whole of the world. And that the history of humanity has been a history of dominance of human destiny by its fragmentary and fragmented character, and that what sets this historical circumstance apart is the need to think cohesively and coherently in order to respond effectively. And it's quite, I think, relevant, for instance, to comment on Jared Diamond's influential book, Collapse, that brilliantly illuminates the success and failure stories that various communities have undergone given the challenges that they faced that imperiled their existence, challenges that were generated by natural disasters or the misuse of water and land and soil resources. But all of these collapses that he investigates comparatively in order to tease out what we can learn to avert collapse, all of them are premised on this scale of a fragment of the whole, as contrasted with the whole. In other words, it is the scale of the current crisis that makes it unique, or almost so. Arguably, nuclear weaponry posed a potential omnicidal threat coupled with the prospect of a nuclear winter that was also global in scale and gave rise to end-of-the-world scenarios. But unlike climate change and related issues of energy transition and water scarcity, it need not be solved globally. In other words, nuclear weapons could be eliminated or arguably stabilized by a very few existing political actors. And even now, with 9 nuclear weapon states, it is quite plausible to imagine, as President Obama did in his Prague speech of a couple of years ago, living in a world without nuclear weapons as a consequence of some agreed process of phased disarmament. In other words, it doesn't presuppose the participation of the whole or a governance structure for the whole. Another feature of the current crisis that is both a source of hope and of worry is that in the past, cataclysmic events were nature-based, and although they could be affected by bad human management, they essentially arose out of the manner in which a particular community or civilization was able to address threats generated by natural events. Diamond makes his study of civilizations that collapsed and those that didn't based on their attentiveness to limits on their sustainability. In other words, those that were appropriately sensitive to the limits that applied to their particular situation had a much enhanced prospect of surviving. In contrast, the climate change and related global crisis is premised on causative relations that are generated by human behavior, which contains an optimistic or hopeful element in the sense that they can also be altered and adapted through human initiative. But what we face at the present time is that although this potentiality for adaptation definitely exists, there is a failure of relevant attentiveness that is giving rise to a variety of forms of despair about the human future or denial in one form or another. Just to give one concrete, rather partisan example, it's somewhat incredible that not one among the current crop of Republican candidates for president is prepared to accept the overwhelming scientific consensus relating to the seriousness of the climate change threat. All of them subscribe to climate skepticism, despite what seems to be a solid consensus among climate specialists that amounts to approximately 98% of those that have the relevant credentials. And one sees a phenomenon here that in some ways resembles the long resistance to accepting the conclusion that smoking was dangerous to human health. And as with that danger, well-funded special interests help to confuse the cognitive landscape in such a way as to create decades of doubt before the consensus prevailed. Here, one's not dealing with individual health, but with the health of the species. And it's not clear that the period of waiting until facts force themselves upon displace the skepticism, it's not clear whether that will occur sufficiently soon to avert the really negative consequences that are multiple and are already in significant evidence. Even the absence of snowfall here in Salt Lake City, I suppose, is part of this awakening, or what should be an awakening, to a set of crisis conditions. And one thing to take notice of is that pre-modern cataclysmic experience highlighted human dependence on nature, giving rise to a sense of humility about the human condition, its precariousness, and the importance of precautionary behavior, storing food supply and water to the extent necessary to meet future adversity. In the modern age, we have a different mentality that is technology-driven, that assumes a human autonomy in relation to nature in the fundamental sense of being able to fashion some kind of solution that will overcome the appearance of a severe threat. This complex impact of technology, which has allowed incredible human progress, but also poses this new set of cataclysmic dangers, could in theory be neutralized or at least deferred by the mobilization of ingenuity, science, and public support. But that doesn't seem to be happening. And one of the things that I think we need to understand is why that isn't happening. Why is there this resistance to acknowledging and responding to this crisis on a global scale? And the first point that I would make is that normal politics, based on understanding politics as the art of the possible, will not, and has shown itself incapable of responding to the challenge. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which established more than any other single actor this scientific consensus as to the reality and depth of the crisis, didn't manage to have a corresponding impact on the global mechanisms of problem solving that were available. The conferences under UN auspices held at Copenhagen, Cancun, and Durban demonstrated, it seems to me, the inability of intergovernmental cooperation to even begin to meet the challenge because it operates. What normal politics does is to operate within what I call horizons of feasibility. And that in a sense is a way of expressing the view that you need mechanisms that can promote global public goods in a manner that transcends the kind of state-centric world order system that has existed for the past several centuries. So that what one finds here is a tension between what I would call, what I have called, the horizon of feasibility and what I label as the horizon of necessity. And it is this gap between feasibility and necessity that establishes the size of that gap, which establishes the crisis nature of the situation confronting humanity at the present time. And there are two main kinds of responses to this gap. That one negative, and which I feel is in its various forms prevailing, and the other constructive, but has yet to emerge in a sufficiently robust form as to engender very much confidence. The negative response to this gap between feasibility and necessity, I want to label horizons of desperation. And the nature of this dysfunctional horizon is expressed by the abandonment of science as a guide to behavior, by a disregard of rationality and reason and the legacies of the Enlightenment. In other words, a retreat from reality that in one of its expressions becomes associated with apocalyptic expectations derived from fundamentalist end-of-the-world scenarios. Or more commonly, this horizon of desperation is expressed by insisting that the problems are not genuine. This is easy to do with climate change, partly because the nature of the challenge is invisible. The harm seems elsewhere and remote and is portrayed as being in the future, somewhat inaccurately portrayed. And it would appear to be very expensive to address this challenge properly, and therefore it would impinge on the economic well-being of societies and alter their standard of living. And it was interesting that at the Rio conference of 1992, the elder President Bush, who didn't attend, although most world leaders did attend, sent a message to the effect, the American standard of living is not negotiable. And it's that attitude of arrogant denial that is refuses to be sensitive to the limits of human endeavor, from my way of thinking, expresses this peril of the situation we confront. In effect, horizons of desperation generate extremisms in political and religious life, and the inversion of extremisms, which are various forms of escapism, and even interpreting the end of the world as a type of entertainment in films, or sometimes as the theme of a video game. The sign of global crisis is the increasing impact on our lives of this rather disorienting upsurge of desperate forms of collective behavior. And in a sense, what I'm trying to suggest is a dysfunctional response to global crisis that isn't it's a way of not acknowledging, not coping with reality, but diverting one's consciousness from that reality. Now, the other way, and the way I associate myself with, is to accept the idea that we do have this gap between feasibility and necessity at the present time, and that we await a transformative development that needs to occur, but that can neither be explained rationally or anticipated by our knowledge of the future. And in that sense, and in a way counterintuitively, I think we're dependent on what I would call a politics of impossibility, which I'll try to explain. In effect, what is required is a cultural revolution that takes place at the level of political consciousness and offers something more than an urgent response to a practical problem. Let's say the unmanageable buildup of greenhouse gases according to present trends. It is this awaiting a transformative event that I want to call horizons of desire, suggesting that we need to have an affirmative vision as well as a practical willingness to escape from impending doom. Horizons of desire is a recognition that hope and even utopian expectations are an energizing part of the human experience and have always been acknowledged by the great world religions and also embedded in the worldview of many indigenous peoples. I have in the past written about a new identity of political engagement that I described as that of the Citizen Pilgrim, an image that I drew from a passage in St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, where he speaks of the pilgrim as someone on a journey to the future, seeking not a normal earthly city, but a heavenly city. In other words, something that does not yet exist, but which an engagement to bring into being is the essence of the spiritual quest. In effect, to give horizons of desire political relevance, many of us in many places, in my view, must act as citizen pilgrims. Put in a different way, we need to trust again in revolutionary possibilities. And that is something that the culture, our political culture in particular, has to learn or relearn. It is a casualty of the failures of totalizing ideologies like communism and fascism that had the spillover effect of discrediting all forms of utopian thinking. And what I'm trying to argue is that in this global crisis, that is disabling us from mounting a constructive, creative response, which depends on the imaginative, it depends on liberating the imagination from the constraints of the present. My argument then up to this point is that the gap between feasibility and necessity can only be closed by the emergence of an affirmative vision that does not, at the present time, seem viable. And that lack of viability creates a collective discomfort with how to address these problems. And I'm reminded of a line of poetry from W.H. Auden, who wrote, "We who are about to die demand a miracle." And it's that sense of helplessness through our human agency to address the problem. And another line of Auden's, in a different poem actually, I think moves toward the incredible difficulty, but the possibility of human agency finding a path to a just and sustainable future, where he writes at the end of a very famous poem, "We must love one another or die." In other words, a sense that in some way human solidarity must emerge as a political force, not just an ethical sentiment, not just an aspect of human rights or of trying to address some of the abuses or intolerances that are that make up the normative agenda to a large degree. And what I'm trying to suggest, tentatively, but still in with conviction, that horizons of desire are indispensable preconditions for achieving the politics of impossibility. I want now to briefly talk about some of the obstacles and opportunities associated with outcomes that reflect this emphasis on the relationship between desire and necessity as distinct from feasibility and necessity. Our current frame of reference is that link between feasibility and necessity, but what I'm suggesting, and it's a suggestion that has a certain spiritual or religious aspect to it, is that our future depends on the bridge between necessity and desire. The most critical impediment to the emergence that I'm considering is the degree to which current world order is structured on the basis of state sovereignty that is, in principle almost, neglectful of the whole. There is the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, but for the way in which the world is organized, the parts are much, much greater than the whole. And that was, in a way, advantageous for centuries of human development. But we've reached a stage now where, and that's the significance I'm attaching to globalization, where we can no longer have hope for the future and achieve the necessary global public goods in this sort of state-centric world order. It doesn't mean that there's a complete indifference to the whole or to global public goods. When mutual interests are present, as they were in protecting the ozone layer or achieving a degree of public order in the oceans or managing the future of Antarctica, it was possible to have relevant forms of cooperative behavior that did serve the global interest. But this doesn't operate in domains of wealth, security, and prestige that engage leading political and economic actors, private and public, throughout the world. Currently, the main promoters and beneficiaries of neoliberal globalization are primarily concerned with the efficiency of capital, not the well-being of people or of the sustainability of the earth. It is this kind of imbalance that has been exhibited in these UN climate change conferences, to which I refer as a kind of microcosm of the broader problems. Without a stronger whole in global affairs, there can be no solution that depends on drastic adjustments by the parts. We like to say that this is a matter that can be addressed at some future time when the issues become more vivid and demanding, but I think that's naive to think that way. This fragmentation of world order is why Hedley Bull's classical depiction of global society as a form of anarchy was so influential and in its way descriptive. More precisely, it is not the fact of state-centrism itself that tells the whole story, but also the inequality of the parts that compose the whole. It is here that the discussion of empire and hegemony creeps into the conversation, and in mainstream circles, the question is posed more euphemistically as one of global leadership. And for a century, this has mainly focused on the role being played by the United States. Often unflattering contrasts are made between the America of the period after World War II that provided benevolent global leadership in the form of the Marshall Plan, helping with the reconstruction of Europe, the writing of the UN Charter and the establishment of the UN, and the containment of Soviet expansionism. All of these were architectural achievements of American global leadership. And it contrasts with the disavowal of any kind of global interest capacity and vocation that seems to characterize the America of the 21st century, or even after the end of the Cold War. And again, not trying to make a casualty of the elder George Bush, but his comment when asked what he had hopes about for the future after the collapse of the Soviet Union was to look somewhat puzzled and finally say, "Oh, you mean the vision thing?" And by that, he really expressed this retreat from a positive global role in fashioning a benevolent future. And it is in a way in contrast with the younger Bush presidency, who in a certain way, responsive to the structure of my argument, did offer a kind of coherent response that basically depended on the administration of global security from its unipolar center in Washington, D.C. In other words, one conception of how to strengthen the whole is not building up the UN, but creating a political actor that serves as the equivalent of a world government. And a well-known political scientist, Michael Mandelbaum, has argued in a couple of books that the United States offers the world the closest thing to world government that it is ever likely to achieve. This seems to me to not be a very persuasive or, in a sense, relevant response, because it's the issue of security, although essential, is not as fundamental as the issues of eco-management or the issues of energy and fundamental resources. And there's no way of really responding to these issues without addressing very deep problems of militarism, nationalism, consumerism, and what might be called plutocracy, that is, the inequalities that are associated with the degree to which wealth is concentrated, the degree to which military capabilities are concentrated. In my view, the world is suffering from this failure of US leadership to acknowledge the magnitude of the global crisis And this is an expression of what I would call geopolitical myopia. It sees the concerns through an optic of the last century and has not the capacity to formulate the kind of coherent response that is needed to address the problems of this century. And this, just very briefly, to give some indication of the loss of self-confidence as well as of capability, can be suggested by just a few statistical measures. The size of the US debt rising to $15.2 trillion, the fact that it would take 4.4 Earths to have resources sufficient to consume as much as the average American, that 1% of American households controls 42.7% of national assets, that 24.3% of political donations are made by 0.1% of Americans, that the richest 20% controls 82.8% of annual income, while the poorest 20% control 1%. So this, it seems clear, at least at the present time, that global leadership, even of a relatively inspired sort, is structurally and ideologically incapable of closing the gaps. I want to bring these remarks to a conclusion by addressing what I think are very serious cognitive issues that also block the formation of a responsive public policy. Our digital age generates an avalanche of information that can be converted into soulless knowledge by technocrats and social scientists. What is missing and what is vital if the horizons of desire are to become relevant is a renewed appreciation of wisdom and spirituality, that which the pre-modern world and the great religions of the world were definitely in tune with, exemplified by indigenous people, including their victimization at the hands of modern rationality. The essence of this wisdom is a existential respect for limits. The culture of the ancient world was filled with this awareness that the failure of human society or the failure of individuals was the generator of tragedy. It's the core of Greek tragedy expressed by the trait of hubris, which seems to me to be the stigma that disables modernity from responding to the realities of the present situation. Now, what I would like to end these remarks with is some sense that there are glimmerings of a new and different way of thinking about political action. First of all, the impossible happens. It's important to remember that. And the impossible, by that I mean that which seems to defy rationality and rational expectations. The outcome of all the major colonial struggles of the last century were initiated in the face of realism by those that were far too weak to have a credible challenge, to be able to mount a credible challenge against their well-armed and sophisticated colonial masters. And consider the Gandhian challenge mounted against the British Empire, an absurdity that prevailed in history, that I believe it was Churchill who referred to the ridiculousness of the British Empire being challenged by what he called a fakir wearing a loincloth. But yet it prevailed, and others prevailed despite being the weaker side. The anti-apartheid campaign in South Africa also was something that transformed a racist regime largely nonviolently through the power of popular mobilization, moral authority, and a sense of what the alternative would be to accommodating these demands. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberation of Eastern Europe were completely out of the horizons of feasibility. And most recently, the Arab Spring is an example that I wish I had time to talk about in more detail, but it provides the self-immolation of a single Tunisian street vendor sparked a series of completely unanticipated transformative uprisings. The people who experienced them never thought that they would experience any change of this sort in their lifetimes. And my own conversations in Cairo the last couple of years testify to the degree to which this was the impossible coming into history as a happening. It's not clear what will the end be. It's not necessarily the case that Act Two will be as exhilarating as Act One of the Arab Spring. And the other aspect of this set of trends that I find hopeful, and I just alluded to and haven't time to really mention in detail, is that the weaker side has been prevailing in the main struggles since the end of World War II. That military superiority, unlike earlier periods, or unlike World War I and World War II, does not have the late 20th century and 21st century to control the political outcome of conflicts. And that lesson is one that our militarist political culture seems incapable of absorbing. And until it absorbs it, and probably can't absorb it unless there's some movement from below, which the Occupy movement gave at least a glimmer to. So there are signs that change of the relevant sort may not be a distant dream. I quote the Indian novelist and activist Arundhati Roy at the end of my remarks. Not only is another world possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. There is, in other words, a bonding taking place between the politics of impossibility and what I would call a necessary utopianism. We can fix this global crisis, but only if we find ways to enliven the relationship between horizons of necessity and horizons of desire. And so by doing, move forward on this never-ending journey of the Citizen Pilgrim, and so lay the foundation, finally, for living well together on the planet. Thank you very much.